Well, good morning, buenos días, buenas tardes, buenas noches. El día de hoy nos encontramos aquí al margen de la FIL y tenemos el gusto de platicar con Karolina Ramqvist. La entrevista será en inglés y vamos a hablar sobre su libro Ciudad Blanca. Good morning, Karolina.
Good morning.
You are now presenting this book named White City. It's an old book in your writing. It's like 2 years ago that you wrote it in English in Sweden. And I would like to start asking you about your work as a journalist. You're a very famous journalist in Sweden. Is it hard to change from the journalist to writing novels?
Yes, I thought it was quite hard, and I had no idea. If I would have known how hard it was, I wouldn't have done it probably. I mean, for me, I always wanted to be a writer, an author. I wanted to be a novelist, but I think that growing up it seemed very hard, and it seemed easier for me to start writing articles and become a journalist. But wanting to write novels was always there. And what happened, because for me being a feminist in Sweden, I realized that it wasn't as much a problem with the actual writing, because I had always been writing and that was always what I wanted to do, but with the appearance in the public maybe. I think I was a little bit naive about, becoming this author figure instead of this journalist, columnist figure. And what happened was that when I wrote, because the White City or La Ciudad Blanca is...
the second part.
Yes, and in the first book, when that came out, that was in 2009 in Sweden, there was a lot of people, I think the way they read it, they didn't really read it as a novel from a novelist, but they read it as a book by a feminist. So they had all these expectations and they were raising all these moral questions like, why do you want to write about a woman living this immoral life with a gangster and letting herself being sustained by this criminal man? And I had not expected that. I think I thought that the minute you put a novel out there, the reader will read it as a novel. But I think that a lot of people were very occupied by what was the message in this book. And for me, it was not really like that for me. But I'm glad that I didn't know on beforehand that would be the kind of reaction, because I think then I would have been a bit daunted to even do it maybe. And now I would say, after having written several novels, this problem isn't that big for me anymore. But it was the transition.
This novel, the main character is a woman, but at times I feel that she is like a victim of her own decisions, of the circumstances she lives, and you don't write the woman as a hero. You write it as a normal being that has sufferings, that has to deal with their decisions. Was it hard for you as a feminist writer, as a feminist columnist, try to make this kind of character?
Yes, I have to admit that I think it was hard. I mean, what you're saying is what I wanted to do. Even with the first book, that was exactly what I wanted to do. I wanted to portray her as a human being, and this is what I want to do in all my writing, because there is this resistance within myself and this urge that I also recognize in a lot of other writers and artists in general, that we have this urge to portray women as good women, or as being role models, or being morally correct. And that is this longing, I think, that is very profound within us, and we have to fight it, because it's such a strong feeling of wanting a woman to be a good person, and sometimes I even think of it as this longing for, the good mother, in a way that we all have. So for me, that was like, when I write, I'm always looking. I think the urge to write for me has a lot to do with getting into a mystery or a problem and an idea, and this is always a big part of it.
One of the things that it seems curious for me is that you're part of a group of writers that in Sweden start writing about novels of crime, cops, investigations. And most of the people here in Mexico have the idea that Sweden is such a peaceful country where you cannot see these kind of things. How do you see Sweden? Like in your novels, or is just an imaginary Sweden?
I see it. I mean, this is true that the crime rate in Sweden is very low, and also, I mean, these things do exist. Organized crime does absolutely exist in Sweden, but it's not like, well, I mean, now it's being talked about as a growing problem, actually, and but I think for me, especially growing up in this, as you're saying, very peaceful country where you have this national image of yourselves as a neutral and a country that will never be in a war and hasn't been in a war for many hundreds of years. Growing up there, for me, I was very curious about violence, because what I would see, I would still see violence in my day-to-day life. And now I'm not talking about organized crime or gang violence or anything like that, more just the ordinary growing up, like on my street there would be boys fighting and there would be this threat of violence that was really interesting to me. Like, how can this exist in you know, where does it come from, in a way? And then as I grew older, I came in touch with these other elements, and I got to know that there was this almost this glamour around crime and around the threat of violence, and this like power structure within criminal organizations. And so I think that there's also this contrast in Sweden, that these things are, you know, they shouldn't really exist, but they do. And especially when it comes to organized crime, we've started to work with this follow the money approach that is very new to Sweden, and which is what happens in the book, that Karin lives with this threat of having her house seized by the authorities and all of the family assets. And this is something that has been, you know, you've been working with this in the States for many, many years, but in Sweden it's completely new. And it's this like a border country, you know, between the society at large and the criminal society. And for me, I've always been interested in how we perceive crime and how we look at criminals and how we look at people who are maybe outside of society in general. And I think that was also one of the reasons for the title, The White City, was that I saw this city as this collective idea of us who haven't done anything wrong, and then there are the others. And this is something that I'm always quite drawn to in my writing. It can be criminals, but it can also be people who are doing things that are not really condoned in other ways.
One of the things that I really like about your book, and at the same time I didn't like it, is that you feel claustrophobic. You feel the fear, the anguish of Karen. You feel like there is no way out of there, and it's kind of, the feeling is good, but at some point you want to close the book and forget the book and try to look outside. Was it hard for you when you were writing this book?
Yes, it was very hard for me. I had to go through a lot because I really wanted to create this feeling that you're talking about, and it made me very also within, because this is within the story, but also within the language. I felt very tense. I was like sitting writing, and I had to start, I had to start exercise, and I had to think a lot about that I was sleeping enough, and because I got so captivated by this feeling myself, and it made me sort of also I was sort of drawn into the actual writing, and I could just sit by my computer and not move, and then like 3 hours would have passed, and I was just not feeling very good.
The last two questions I will make you, I want to refer to your work as a journalist. Mm-hmm. You, as I told you before, you work feminism in your writing. What are the challenges that the feminism has in Sweden, and what challenges you see of the feminism in Latin America? What do you see from Sweden, from here?
Well, from a Swedish point of view, I think now something is happening that I and other feminists have been talking about for many, many years, which is an intersectional discourse that has to do with, taking into account other power structures than just gender, because from my perspective, we cannot only be talking about, men and women. We need to also see questions of skin color and the economic structure and issues of the body functionings, and all these things needs to be taken in account. So I think now feminism in Sweden has had this a very constructive fusion with anti-racism, and that we've been able to see that women of color have a different situation than other women in Sweden, and we need to always look at power structures as something that is constantly changing depending on the situation, and this has been a big challenge, I think, but now there is more influence from American feminists and American scholars, which has been very good. And also, I would say that this is probably like the main challenge for feminism in all countries, that you need to be able to keep many questions at the same time, and you need to be able to have a broader look at society at large, and not to be too concerned about the female part of feminism, and not to get too caught up in gender, because that is like the challenge, I think, constantly, that we need to, even us as feminists, need to be aware of our own prejudice within gender stereotypes, and we need to see that women too are human beings. Women aren't heroes or perfect or always good.
What is the next in your work here in Mexico or in Spanish, and what are you writing now in Sweden?
I'm not sure what will next be translated into Spanish, but my last book that I would love to have translated, that was an essay called "It's the Night," which is about a cleft or a division within me as a writer between the writer with a capital W, who is the figure who's talking like this about what she's written, and the other person who is the one sitting by the computer in her pajamas, maybe with like no makeup, in her bedroom and trying to write. And this was something that happened to me a few years ago when I did a lot of interviews and started to discover that in the eye of the public in Sweden, the writer had become a public figure more than an artist, maybe. So that when you would think about writers, you would think about these people sitting in TV studios doing interviews like this, or doing panels and talks, when we're actually people who sit by ourselves in these dark rooms and are just completely, confused, not knowing what we're doing and taking on this impossible task of writing a book. And so the essay deals with these questions and with the impossibility also in talking about the book. Because as a writer, what you want to do, you just want to hand it over to the reader, because the book belongs to the reader, really. It's the reader who finishes it and makes it into what it is.
Well, thank you very much, Karolina.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you so much.